In a small town, there was an old, decrepit hotel known as the Crimson Inn. Built in the 1800s, it was rumored to be haunted. The legend centered around room 13, which had a distinct red door. Local folklore suggested that the room was cursed, and anyone who stayed there would encounter unimaginable horrors. Emily, a travel blogger, decided to stay at the Crimson Inn to uncover the truth behind the legends. Upon arrival, she was greeted by the eerie silence of the empty lobby and the peculiar gaze of the hotel's elderly caretaker, Mr. Thornton. Ignoring his warnings about room 13, she insisted on staying there. That night, Emily experienced a cold, unnatural draft in her room. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread. As she settled into bed, the lights flickered and then went out completely. In the darkness, she heard whispers, soft, incoherent murmurs that seemed to come from all around her. Suddenly, the room's temperature dropped drastically, and she saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. It had no discernible features, just a dark silhouette with glowing red eyes. Frozen with fear, Emily couldn't move or scream. The entity slowly advanced toward her, and she felt an overwhelming sense of malevolence. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Emily shaken and terrified. She spent the rest of the night huddled under the covers, praying for dawn. The next morning, she found strange markings on the walls, symbols she didn't recognize. Determined to uncover their meaning, she visited the town's library. Emily discovered that the symbols were part of an ancient ritual used to summon demons. She also learned that a series of gruesome murders had occurred in the hotel over a century ago. The victims were all found in room 13, their bodies mutilated and their faces twisted in terror. Despite her fear, Emily decided to spend another night in the room, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. As darkness fell, she set up her camera and waited. Midnight came and the whispers started again, louder and more menacing. The shadowy figure reappeared, this time accompanied by a foul stench. Emily watched in horror as the entity moved towards her camera, distorting the footage. It then turned its attention to her, its eyes burning with hatred. The room filled with an oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. She felt a cold hand grasp her ankle and drag her towards the red door. Struggling to break free, Emily screamed for help. The door creaked open, revealing a dark abyss filled with tortured souls. Their agonized wails echoed in her ears, and she felt herself being pulled into the void. Just as she was about to be swallowed by the darkness, she managed to grab hold of the bedpost. With a surge of adrenaline, she pulled herself free and bolted out of the room. She ran down the hallway, the demonic entity hot on her heels. She reached the lobby and burst through the front door, collapsing on the sidewalk. Mr. Thornton found her there the next morning, unconscious and pale. Emily awoke in the hospital, surrounded by concerned doctors and nurses. She told them about her ordeal, but no one believed her. The footage from her camera was missing, and the hotel caretaker denied any knowledge of the events she described. Determined to prove she wasn't crazy, Emily returned to the Crimson Inn. This time, she came armed with holy water and a crucifix. She demanded to see room 13, but Mr. Thornton refused, claiming it was off limits. Ignoring his protests, she broke into the room, only to find it empty and devoid of the symbols she had seen before. Desperate for answers, Emily performed a cleansing ritual, hoping to banish the demon. As she chanted the incantations, the room began to shake violently. The walls bled, and the air filled with the screams of the damned. The shadowy figure reappeared, furious and vengeful. The entity lunged at her, but Emily stood her ground, holding up the crucifix. The demon shrieked in pain and retreated, its form dissolving into the darkness. The room fell silent, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Exhausted, Emily collapsed on the bed. When she awoke, the red door was gone, replaced by a plain wooden one. The symbols had vanished, and the hotel seemed normal. Emily left the Crimson Inn, vowing never to return. Though she had survived the encounter, she knew the demon was still out there, waiting for its next victim. The old Victorian hotel on the outskirts of town, known as the Bell Tower Inn, was a relic of a bygone era. It had a sinister reputation, largely due to the ancient bell tower that loomed ominously over the building. Legend had it that the bell rang on its own, heralding doom for whoever heard its eerie toll. James, a paranormal investigator, checked into the Bell Tower Inn with his team, eager to explore its haunted history. They were assigned to the top floor, where the bell tower was located. The innkeeper, a nervous man named Mr. Harris, warned them about the bell, but James brushed off his concerns. On their first night, the team set up their equipment, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. As midnight approached, a chilling wind blew through the hallway, and the bell began to toll. The sound was deafening and filled with a deep sense of foreboding. James felt a sudden coldness envelop him. Ignoring the unease, James and his team climbed the narrow staircase to the bell tower. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. When they reached the top, they found the bell swaying gently, despite the absence of wind. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The only light came from the team's flashlights, which flickered ominously. A low, guttural growl emanated from the shadows, and they could see a pair of glowing red eyes staring at them. Panic set in as the entity began to take shape, a grotesque, demonic figure. The demon lunged at them, its claws raking the air. The team scattered, trying to find a way out. James managed to grab a holy relic from his bag and held it up, hoping to ward off the creature. The demon recoiled but did not retreat. Instead, it seemed to grow angrier. Desperate, James and his team fled back down the stairs, the demon close behind. They barricaded themselves in their room, but the bell continued to toll, each ring resonating with malevolent energy. The walls of the room began to bleed, and the temperature plummeted. James tried to contact the innkeeper for help, but there was no response. The demon's growls grew louder, and the air filled with the stench of sulfur. The team huddled together, their fear palpable. The door burst open, and the demon entered, its eyes blazing with fury. With no other options, James recited an exorcism ritual he had memorized. The demon screamed in agony, thrashing wildly. The room shook violently, and the lights exploded, plunging them into darkness. The bell's toll grew louder, nearly deafening them. Just as James finished the incantation, the demon vanished, leaving behind a heavy silence. The temperature in the room slowly returned to normal, and the bleeding walls ceased their gruesome display. The team was shaken but relieved to be alive. They decided to leave the bell tower Inn immediately, but as they packed their belongings, they heard a final toll of the bell. James knew that the demon had been banished, but the curse of the bell tower remained. He vowed to return and find a way to break it once and for all. Over the next few months, James researched the history of the Bell Tower Inn and discovered that the bell had been cursed by a witch in the 1800s. She had been wrongfully accused of witchcraft and executed, her spirit bound to the bell in a final act of vengeance. Determined to lift the curse, James returned to the inn with a new plan. He brought with him a group of experienced exorcists and a collection of powerful artifacts. Together, they climbed the bell tower once more, prepared to face the demon again. As they began the ritual to break the curse, the bell tolled and the demon reappeared, more furious than ever. The exorcists formed a protective circle around the bell, chanting the incantations. The air grew thick with energy, and the demon howled in rage. In a final desperate effort, James placed a consecrated relic on the bell. The demon screamed and dissolved into a cloud of smoke. The bell tower shook violently before falling silent. The curse was lifted, and the bell no longer tolled. The Bell Tower Inn was finally at peace, but James knew that the memory of the demon would haunt him forever. The Grand Hotel, once a luxurious retreat for the wealthy, had fallen into disrepair. It was now a shadow of its former self, a dilapidated building with a dark reputation. Room 214 was infamous for the terrifying experiences of those who dared to stay there. Sarah, a skeptic of the supernatural, decided to spend a weekend in room 214 to debunk the ghost stories. She checked in late at night, the hotel eerily quiet. The receptionist, a young woman with a haunted expression, handed her the key with trembling hands, warning her to be careful. As Sarah entered room 214, she immediately felt a sense of unease. The air was heavy, and the room was uncomfortably cold. Ignoring the chill, she set up her camera to document her stay. She planned to record her entire experience to prove that the stories were nothing more than urban legends. Around midnight, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and Sarah noticed a dark figure standing in the corner. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but the figure began to move towards her, its form becoming more defined. The figure was a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a sinister grin. He whispered Sarah's name, his voice a cold, raspy hiss. She tried to turn on the lights, but they wouldn't respond. The man's grin widened, revealing rows of sharp, blackened teeth. Panicked, Sarah backed away, but the man advanced, his eyes glowing with malevolent intent. The walls of the room seemed to close in on her, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. She could hear the sound of children crying and a woman's anguished screams. Desperate to escape, Sarah grabbed her camera and ran out of the room. She bolted down the hallway, the sinister whispers following her. She reached the lobby, where the receptionist stood, her eyes vacant and unseeing. Sarah's pleas for help went unanswered. Sarah fled to her car, but the engine wouldn't start. The hotel's front door slammed shut, and she could see the dark figure approaching through the windows. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with horrific images of death and despair. In a last-ditch effort, Sarah decided to confront the entity. She returned to room 214, armed with a makeshift crucifix and her camera. The dark figure awaited her, its eyes gleaming with anticipation. She raised the crucifix and began to recite a prayer, her voice trembling. The figure laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. The room began to shake, and the walls bled a thick, black ichor. Sarah continued her prayer, but the entity seemed unaffected. It reached out and grabbed her arm, its touch freezing cold. Sarah felt her strength waning as the entity tightened its grip. She could hear the cries of the damned echoing around her, their voices pleading for release. With her last ounce of strength, she held up the camera, hoping to capture the entity's true form. The entity recoiled from the camera's flash, its form flickering. Seizing the opportunity, Sarah recited a banishing incantation she had read in an old book. The entity howled in rage, its form dissolving into a cloud of smoke. The room fell silent, and the temperature returned to normal. Exhausted, Sarah collapsed on the bed, her body trembling. She reviewed the footage on her camera and saw the entity's terrifying visage. Determined to expose the truth, she left the hotel, vowing to never return. She shared her footage online, and it quickly went viral. The Grand Hotel was closed down soon after, deemed too dangerous for guests. Sarah became a renowned paranormal investigator, her skepticism replaced by a deep respect for the supernatural. She continued to explore haunted locations, always carrying her camera and a crucifix. Though she had survived her encounter with the entity in room 214, the memory haunted her. She knew that the dark figure was still out there, waiting for its next victim. The Grand Hotel remained abandoned, a silent testament to the horrors that lurked within its walls.